March 1946. The world was exhaling. The Second World War had finally ended, and the global consciousness was beginning to shift from the horrors of the battlefield to the rebuilding of a broken civilization. But in the interior of Brazil, in the state of São Paulo, there was a small village called Araçariguama that felt as though it existed in a different century entirely. In 1946, Araçariguama was a place of deep shadows. There was no electricity, there were no telephones. Life was governed by the rising and setting of the sun and the heavy, humid silence of the surrounding forests. On Monday, March 4th, that silence was even more profound. It was Carnival Monday. For most of Brazil, this was a day of explosive music and vibrant color. In Araçariguama, the streets were empty. Almost the entire population, including the wife and 5 children of a local farmer named João Prestes Filho, had traveled 7 miles away to the town of São Roque to celebrate the festivities. João Prestes was not a man for crowds or loud music. He was a man of the earth, a 40-year-old farmer who preferred the quietude of the river. He had spent the day with his friend, Salvador dos Santos, fishing on the banks of the Tietê River. It was a day of peace, the kind of unremarkable, beautiful day that makes the horror of what followed feel even more impossible. As evening began to settle over the valley, João and Salvador packed their fishing gear into a horse-drawn wooden cart and began the slow trek home. By the time João dropped Salvador off at his doorstep, the sun had long since dipped below the horizon. The village was a blanket of black. The 3-mile journey from Salvador's house to João's own farm was a path he had traveled 1,000 times. But on this night, something was different. According to the accounts João would later give, he felt a weight in the air, a prickle on the back of his neck that told him he was being watched. In a town with no streetlights, the darkness of the Brazilian forest is absolute. Every rustle of the brush, every snap of a dry branch felt like it was following his pace. He urged his horse on to quicken its step, his eyes darting into the tree line, seeing nothing but the suffocating black of the jungle. When he finally reached his home, he was breathless. He reached for the door handle only to realize his wife had forgotten to leave him the key. He was locked out, alone, with a growing sense of dread that something was standing just beyond the reach of his vision in the dark. Desperate to get inside, João circled the house. He found a window that had been left slightly ajar. He hoisted himself up, squeezing through the wooden frame and dropping into the relative safety of his dark living room. But the feeling of being watched didn't vanish. It intensified. The air in the room felt thick, vibrating with a subtle, electric charge. Driven by an instinct he couldn't name, João turned back toward the window he had just entered. He expected to see a man standing there. Instead, he saw a light. It wasn't a lantern or a torch. Hovering just outside the house was a luminous sphere, a ball of fire that seemed to pulse with an internal, terrifying energy. Before he could even process what he was looking at, the sphere reacted. A beam of light erupted from the object. João would later describe it as a torch of fire or a spray of light that struck him directly. The encounter lasted only a matter of seconds. João instinctively threw his hands up to protect his face as the brilliance washed over him. He felt no immediate pain, no searing heat of a flame, no electric shock. He felt only a sickening, hollow weakness. The light vanished as quickly as it had appeared, leaving João standing in the darkness of his home, trembling while his body began to undergo a transformation that defies every law of biology. Terror took hold. João managed to unlatch his front door with his teeth, his hands already beginning to feel stiff and strange, and he ran. He ran toward the house of his sister Maria, located a significant distance away. He ran barefoot across the sharp, jagged rocks of the rural paths in the pitch dark. By the time he reached Maria's door, his feet were a bloody, mangled mess, but he didn't seem to notice. He collapsed into the house, screaming that he had been burned. Maria, horrified by the sight of her brother, immediately sent for the local authorities and the rest of the family. The village police chief, João Malaquias, was one of the first to arrive. He was a man accustomed to the rough realities of rural life, but what he saw in that room would stay with him for the rest of his life. He sat by João's side to take a statement. João was lucid, his mind clear, but his body was failing at a rate that was visually perceptible. Malaquias looked down at João's legs and saw something that shouldn't be possible. The flesh was turning a roasted red color. As the minutes ticked by, the skin began to wrinkle and crack. Then, it began to detach. Malaquias would later testify that the flesh was coming away from the bone in large chunks, appearing in his words like meat that had been allowed to boil for a long time. As the family gathered, they noticed the most baffling detail of the entire case, a detail that still keeps investigators awake at night. João had been burned so severely that his skin was sloughing off his limbs. Yet his hair was completely intact. More importantly, his clothes, his cotton shirt and his trousers, bore no marks at all. There was no soot. There were no singe marks. There was no smell of kerosene or alcohol or smoke. The beam had passed through his clothing as if it weren't there, and yet it had effectively cooked the man underneath. Modern science offers a terrifying potential explanation for this: high-frequency radiation or microwave energy. These forces don't burn the surface like a fire. They vibrate the water molecules inside the cells, heating the tissue from the inside out. This explains why dry cotton survived while the water-dense human body was destroyed. But in 1946, in a village with no electricity, where would such a focused radiation weapon come from? Police Chief Malaquias knew João would not survive the night without a hospital. The nearest major facility was in São Paulo, but the roads were treacherous mud tracks, impassable in the dark. They decided to take him to the smaller Santana de Parnaíba hospital. They loaded João into the back of a truck. The journey was a nightmare. With every jolt of the vehicle, João's condition worsened. His family watched in silent horror as their brother and father literally began to fall apart. By the time they reached the hospital, he was described as truly ruinous. The doctors and orderlies who received him had never seen anything like it. They recorded that João did not smell like a burn victim. There was no charred scent. Instead, there was a strange clinical breakdown of the tissue. One orderly later remarked that it was as if he was decomposing alive. João remained conscious through much of this. He was in agony, yet he continued to tell his story to anyone who would listen. He insisted that the light was not of this world. He spoke until his throat and tongue became so swollen that his voice was lost to a rasping silence. When the tissue around his jaw finally failed, his eyes were the only part of him that could still communicate the terror of what he had seen. João Prestes Filho died at approximately 9 a.m. on March 5, 1946, less than 12 hours after the light had struck him. The official death certificate listed cardiac arrest and generalized burns. It was a clinical label for a death that was anything but clinical. After his death, the rumors in Araçariguama began to swirl. The locals spoke of the Boitatá, the fiery serpent of ancient Tupi legend, a beast of light that had haunted the forests for centuries. Others spoke of the Assombrações, ghostly spirits with glowing eyes. But as the decades passed, the case caught the attention of the scientific and ufological communities. They looked at the similarities between João's death and other incidents in Brazil. They looked at Operation Saucer in 1977, where residents of Colares were hunted by chupa-chupa, probes that shot beams of light, leaving victims with radiation burns and anemia. They looked at the case of Rivelino Mafra da Silva in 1962, who vanished into a yellow mist after two spheres merged in front of his home. There are those who suggest João was the victim of a secret weapon. After the war, the United States maintained a naval presence in São Paulo. Is it possible that a top-secret energy weapon was being tested in the remote wilderness? If so, why target a lone farmer? Others point to natural phenomena like ball lightning, but ball lightning is an atmospheric discharge. It leaves electrical burns, entry and exit wounds. It doesn't cause systemic internal tissue decomposition while leaving hair and clothing untouched. The case of João Prestes Filho remains a jagged piece of a puzzle that doesn't fit into our understanding of reality. He was a man who stayed home to avoid the noise, only to be met by a silent, lethal light that treated his body like a laboratory specimen. If you walk the paths of Araçariguama today, the forest is still there, dark, thick, and watchful. And the story of the man who melted remains a whispered warning. We like to believe that our homes are fortresses, that the walls and windows we build can keep the world out. But for João Prestes, the window wasn't a barrier, it was a lens. And whatever was looking through that lens that night wasn't interested in his life, only his destruction. He died in a hospital bed, his flesh falling away, leaving behind a mystery that has survived for 80 years. A mystery that suggests that sometimes the things we see in the dark are not just shadows. Sometimes the light is far more dangerous,